And once it stuck, Walker stopped being a character. Released in 1967, Point Blank baffled those who expected a conventional crime drama. What they got was a film with no emotional anchor, no narrative certainty, and no resolution that feels like an answer. Instead of offering closure, it offers questions. And instead of a man, it gives you a presence. Lee Marvin's Walker, cold, unreadable, and maybe already gone. Director John Boorman dismantled genre expectations piece by piece. He fractured time. He stripped away dialogue. He lit scenes like morgues and filled the silences with echoes. What emerged wasn't a thriller. It was something closer to psychological hauntology, a story told through absence, a character defined by what's been removed. But what audiences didn't see is what was left out by design and what was lost along the way. How key scenes were filmed in restricted locations, how the lead actor erased entire pages of dialogue, how the soundtrack wasn't composed, it was constructed out of ambient decay, and how the final cut emerged only because the director broke the studio's rule. It took a legal roadblock to invent a name that felt more like a haunting than a human. But before you decide what this film is, you need to see what it was never supposed to be. These are 20 weird facts you didn't know about Point Blank, and they might just change how you see every frame. Fact 1. Lee Marvin silenced his character, not out of ego, but to erase his humanity. In the original screenplay, Walker was written as talkative, angry, expressive, and occasionally even vulnerable. But when Lee Marvin signed on, he saw something different. He envisioned a man whose pain had calcified into something quieter, something harder, a void. So he began to cut. Dialogue wasn't rewritten, it was eliminated. Marvin removed monologues, pared down scenes, and refused to speak lines that explained too much. When challenged, he simply said, "He's not here to explain." Boorman didn't fight him, he adjusted, and the transformation began. The result was a protagonist that barely speaks, but still commands every frame. Walker doesn't negotiate, he doesn't plead. His presence is pure intent, stripped of emotion, stripped of commentary. A man reduced to action alone. The studio was baffled, writers were frustrated, but the effect was undeniable. With every line removed, Marvin added weight. Every pause became heavier than a speech. Every glance held more than a page of exposition ever could. Some critics at the time found it jarring, but decades later, it's seen as revolutionary. Silence became narrative. Emptiness became identity. Because when a man is emptied of feeling, what's left isn't coldness, it's gravity. Fact 2. The opening scenes weren't just unsettling, they were shot illegally on restricted government property. Those first shots of Walker stumbling through the crumbling halls of Alcatraz aren't sets. They're not recreations. They're real. And they weren't authorized. Alcatraz was still under the control of federal authorities at the time. Access was restricted, and film permits were nearly impossible to secure. So Boorman and his minimal crew devised another method. They went in quietly, early morning. No announcement, no lights. Just Marvin, a handheld camera, and the decaying ruins of a once-feared prison. They moved quickly, grabbing shots in the cell blocks and corridors before anyone could intervene. The emptiness, the echo, the air of abandonment, it wasn't designed. It was simply what existed in that moment. MGM didn't know. When they found out, they were livid. Legal teams debated removing the footage entirely, but it stayed, quietly, uncredited, unmarketed. That guerrilla-style decision gave the film something no studio production could fake: unease, authentic, institutional coldness, the kind of dread that no soundstage can replicate. And in a story where the lines between life and death, memory and fantasy, are already blurred, starting inside a real prison that didn't grant permission was oddly poetic. Fact 3. The film's disjointed sound design wasn't a flaw, it was a weapon. You might not notice it consciously, but something about the way Point Blank sounds feels fractured. Footsteps echo unevenly, dialogue seems distant, gunfire hits with no warning and disappears without reverb. Scenes bleed together in ways that feel wrong but unmistakably intentional. MGM executives hated it. They thought the mix was broken. Boorman refused to change a frame. Fact 3. The film's disjointed sound design wasn't a flaw, it was a weapon. One hallway scene is especially notorious. Walker walks toward the camera, alone, while his footsteps echo like gunshots. No score, no voice, just space, repetition, and threat. The effect is haunting. Viewers describe a feeling of dislocation, of being one step removed from what they're watching. Sound becomes the emotional architecture of the film even more than music. MGM executives hated it. They thought the mix was broken. Boorman refused to change a frame. That's because Boorman and sound editor Gordon Daniel built the film's audio like a psychological landscape. They separated sounds from images, amplified some, suppressed others. Room tones don't match their spaces. Ambience drifts across scenes, carrying mood instead of logic. Fact 4. There's a theory that Walker dies in the first scene and everything after is just echoes. It begins with a betrayal. A man is shot, left bleeding on a cold concrete floor in an abandoned prison. Then, without explanation, he's walking again. No hospital, no healing, just presence. That's not how stories work. But it's exactly how Point Blank works. Many viewers have questioned the film's reality structure. Why does Walker never bleed again? Why does no one ever truly connect with him? Why does time feel broken, repeating moments, reshuffling sequences? The theory is this: Walker dies at the start. Everything that follows is imagined, a purgatorial revenge loop created by a consciousness that refuses to let go. Not real vengeance, just the fantasy of unfinished business. Boorman has never confirmed it, but he hasn't dismissed it either. In interviews, he said, "I wanted the film to feel untethered, like the world was slightly out of sync. That world, cold, quiet, and artificial, fits the logic of a dying mind. It explains the non-linear structure, the lack of continuity, the way Walker seems invisible to some, unstoppable to others, the way nothing truly ends. If you accept this view, Point Blank ceases to be a crime film. It becomes a ghost story." The theory is this: Walker dies at the start. Everything that follows is imagined, a purgatorial revenge loop created by a consciousness that refuses to let go. Not real vengeance, just the fantasy of unfinished business. It becomes a ghost story. One of the most prominent inspirations was Giorgio de Chirico, known for painting desolate plazas, strange shadows, and small, solitary figures. De Chirico's work creates a mood of detached unease. Boorman brought that same feeling to the screen through framing, color, and space. The theory is this: Walker dies at the start. Everything that follows is imagined, a purgatorial revenge loop created by a consciousness that refuses to let go. Not real vengeance, just the fantasy of unfinished business. It becomes a ghost story. Even the camera seems to be observing him from a distance, never empathizing, never entering his world. What you see isn't noir, it's surrealism disguised as crime, a gallery of loneliness. Fact 6. Lee Marvin didn't have to imagine Walker's pain, he brought his own. Long before Point Blank, Marvin had served in World War II. He was shot, hospitalized, left with shrapnel embedded near his spine for the rest of his life. His limp in the film? That's not acting. It's history. He didn't talk much about the war, but it informed everything he did, especially in this film. A gallery of loneliness. Fact 6. Lee Marvin didn't have to imagine Walker's pain, he brought his own. Fact 6. Lee Marvin didn't have to imagine Walker's pain, he brought his own. He didn't talk much about the war, but it informed everything he did, especially in this film. He believed in silence, in stillness, in showing a man who has already lived through worse than anything the plot could throw at him, and that truth unspoken fills every frame. Fact 7. One pivotal location wasn't just eerie, it had a real history of death behind glass. There's a scene in Point Blank where Walker confronts one of the higher-ups in a sterile, windowless room divided by security glass. It's an emotionally dead space, muted, claustrophobic, almost too cold to be fictional. And it wasn't. That location was real, not a set, not dressed. It was a repurposed section of a decommissioned federal facility once used for last-stage legal processing. Prisoners awaiting execution would pass through those rooms, meeting with attorneys, signing final waivers, speaking their last words through thick panes of glass. The production team didn't know the full history at first. They chose the site for its brutal design, white walls, bolted furniture, reflective surfaces. But once the background surfaced, no one changed course. Boorman didn't flinch. In fact, he embraced the tension. When Marvin stood in that room, he didn't speak. He just stared. The shot lingers. No score. Just fluorescent buzz. Some say you can feel it, that the weight of what once happened there bleeds into the scene, that the silence isn't cinematic, it's structural, architectural, inescapable. It's rare that a film accidentally walks into real-world metaphor, but Point Blank didn't flinch when it did. It just let the walls speak. Fact 8. The studio didn't understand the film and tried to make it disappear. When MGM executives first watched the completed cut of Point Blank, they weren't just confused, they were alarmed. The film lacked conventional structure. The main character barely spoke, time seemed broken, motives were unclear. To them, it didn't feel like a thriller. It felt like sabotage. They called for edits, more clarity, more exposition. Marvin refused. Boorman refused. The film stayed as it was, but the price was silent. MGM didn't launch a full campaign. There were no major interviews, no television spots, no industry buzz, posters were vague, theatrical rollout was limited. Internally, it was treated like a misstep, an experiment best forgotten. But outside the studio's control, the film found life. In Europe, critics embraced its ambiguity. In universities, it became a case study in anti-structure. Filmmakers quietly passed it around, and slowly, its legend grew. Boorman once said, "They didn't kill it, they buried it." But sometimes, things grow in the dark. Point Blank wasn't made for 1967. It was made for the kind of audience that wouldn't arrive until years later. Fact 9. The name Walker was a last-minute change and became more iconic than the original. In Donald E. Westlake's novel, The Hunter, the central figure is named Parker, a brutal, methodical anti-hero. But when Boorman adapted the book, he didn't follow the narrative beat for beat. His version was colder, more abstract, more surreal. It was made for the kind of audience that wouldn't arrive until years later. That's how Parker became Walker. In Donald E. Westlake's novel, The Hunter, the central figure is named Parker, a brutal, methodical anti-hero. But when Boorman adapted the book, he didn't follow the narrative beat for beat. His version was colder, more abstract, more surreal. MGM didn't launch a full campaign. There were no major interviews, no television spots, no industry buzz, posters were vague, theatrical rollout was limited. Internally, it was treated like a misstep, an experiment best forgotten. Later adaptations returned to the name Parker, but none carried the same weight. None blurred the line between man and myth the way Point Blank did. In trying to avoid a lawsuit, they stumbled into something more powerful. They named him after what he does and left who he is unanswered. Fact 10. Marvin deleted most of his lines, and what remained was more powerful than dialogue. Walker wasn't born silent. The original drafts gave him lines sharp, clipped, but undeniably human. There were confrontations, fragments of introspection, brief flashes of emotion. Lee Marvin erased nearly all of it. On set, he reviewed each scene and crossed out anything he felt the character wouldn't say. His reasoning was consistent. Walker is not here to connect. He's not seeking empathy. He's not here to explain. He's here to resolve. Boorman didn't fight back. He watched Marvin dismantle the role, turning it into something elemental, a presence instead of a personality. The absence of voice became the point. The silence wasn't emptiness, it was a message. Executives were unsettled. Test audiences were confused. But in retrospect, the decision became one of the film's defining strokes. Every withheld word tightened the tension. Every silence deepened the unease. Marvin once said in an interview, "You don't need to say anything when everyone already knows what you're there for." And that's what Walker became, not a man talking his way through vengeance, but one who has nothing left to say. Because the deeper the wound, the quieter it becomes. Fact 10. Marvin deleted most of his lines, and what remained was more powerful than dialogue. And that's what Walker became, not a man talking his way through vengeance, but one who has nothing left to say. Executives were unsettled. Test audiences were confused. But in retrospect, the decision became one of the film's defining strokes. Every withheld word tightened the tension. Every silence deepened the unease. He once said, "Trauma doesn't obey time. Why should the story?" Fact 10. Marvin deleted most of his lines, and what remained was more powerful than dialogue. The studio didn't approve. They asked for a traditional cut. Boorman refused. Marvin supported him. Executives were unsettled. Test audiences were confused. But in retrospect, the decision became one of the film's defining strokes. Every withheld word tightened the tension. Every silence deepened the unease. He once said, "Trauma doesn't obey time. Why should the story?" It dares you to make sense of something that was never designed to make sense. There's a method in the madness. Certain scenes loop with slight differences. Some conversations feel rehearsed. Walker's journey isn't linear, it's recursive. Every confrontation feels like a memory replaying itself, hoping to land differently. One of the film's most violent moments involves a character being shoved backward and disappearing from view with bone-snapping impact. It looks real, because it was. The stunt, simple on paper, was meant to be clean, controlled descent onto a crash mat. But on the day of filming, the performer's body twisted mid-air, causing him to miss the padding and crash into metal supports. There was no time to brace, no chance to redo it. Filming stopped. Paramedics were called. The actor survived, but only just. Later, Boorman asked whether they should reshoot. The injured performer declined. "It felt real," he said. "Use it." And so they did. The footage that made it into the final cut captures not just a fall, but a mistake, a body in freefall, pain without choreography. It's a blink and you miss it moment. But it carries weight. You feel it in your gut. It's not clean. It's not cool. It's not safe. And so they did. The footage that made it into the final cut captures not just a fall, but a mistake, a body in freefall, pain without choreography. Fact 12. A stunt went terribly wrong, and the film kept the real pain, and lets reality slip in for a second too long. And so they did. The footage that made it into the final cut captures not just a fall, but a mistake, a body in freefall, pain without choreography. So he began re-editing the film in secret. With Marvin's backing, Boorman and his editor reshuffled scenes at night, without studio oversight. They stripped out explanations, rearranged entire sequences, held on to silence longer than protocol allowed. Studio execs were still expecting a linear crime film. What Boorman delivered instead was a mood, circular, dreamlike, disoriented. He never asked permission. When MGM screened the final cut, confusion turned to alarm. "What happened to the script we paid for?" one exec asked. Marvin, sitting quietly in the room, replied, "You paid for me. There was no recut." The studio gave up the fight, quietly, grudgingly, and the version we know today exists not because it was endorsed, but because no one could stop it. Fact 14. The composer abandoned the score and left the film half-finished in sound. Johnny Mandel was brought in to give Point Blank a musical backbone, jazz motifs, noir tension, traditional scaffolding. He began composing. Then, suddenly, he left. No farewell, no completed master. What happened? Accounts vary. Some blame creative differences. Others say Mandel walked after hearing how the film was being cut fragmented, experimental, without narrative continuity. His music, built for cohesion, no longer fit. Boorman improvised. Alongside sound designer Gordon Daniel, he stitched together a sonic world from leftover elements, broken cues, ambient field recordings, structural hums, elevators, footsteps, wind through vents. Instead of music, they built presence. The result was an aural disquiet, a constant tension that never resolves. Scenes don't swell with strings or cool jazz. They breathe with airless restraint. Mandel's unfinished work has never been released. No official soundtrack was issued. No full score recovered. But what was lost might have been a gift, because the silence Point Blank moves through is more haunting than any melody. Fact 15. Marvin wasn't just the lead, he may have directed more than people realize. Official credits list Boorman as the sole director, but stories from the set suggest something else. Marvin, already a Hollywood veteran, had a reputation for knowing exactly what worked on screen. During production, crew members noted that he didn't just take direction, he gave it. Blocking, lighting, even lens selection. In certain scenes, Boorman deferred entirely. One standout, the silent walk through a government corridor. No dialogue, no score, just a camera tracking Walker through institutional emptiness. The framing, the pace, even the timing of the footsteps rumored to be all Marvin. Boorman, to his credit, never denied it. "Lee had an instinct for space and silence," he said years later. "Sometimes it was better to let him lead. There was no ego in it." Marvin never claimed co-director status. He never sought credit, but those on set knew, and it shows. The stillness, the exactness, the way scenes breathe without exposition. They weren't just performed, they were composed. Fact 16. One subplot was erased because it hinted at real power structures the studio didn't want to name. Buried in early drafts of Point Blank is a narrative thread that never made it to the final cut. A series of quiet references to government contractors, intelligence connections, and high-level interference. It wasn't explicit, but it was enough. The story positioned Walker's enemies not just as criminals or corrupt businessmen, but as figures embedded in institutions that mirrored real Cold War-era organizations. The lines were subtle. Phrases like Pacific Council, references to undisclosed assets, whispers about federal cooperation. Then it disappeared. MGM executives flagged the language. Legal teams reviewed early cuts. Concerns were raised not just about lawsuits, but optics. This wasn't just fiction anymore. It risked landing too close to confidential partnerships the public didn't know existed. Boorman was pressured. Scenes were trimmed, dialogue revised, props replaced. The final film stripped away most of the implications, but faint fingerprints remain. a file glimpsed for half a second, a name partially obscured, a phrase that sounds coded. Even now, the film was never accused of anything, but it no longer had to be, because what was removed said more than what remained. Fact 17. Walker's gun never runs out, and that impossibility was entirely deliberate. Watch closely. Walker shoots, then shoots again. He never reloads, never checks his weapon, no spare magazines, no pauses, just continuous, mechanical precision. It's not realism, it's myth-building. Borman admitted that the choice was symbolic. You don't question whether the Grim Reaper has to reload, he once said. Walker isn't a soldier, he's inevitability. The gun isn't a weapon, it's ritual. By denying him human limitations, the film reshapes him. He isn't bound by cause and effect. He doesn't fear logistics. He arrives, executes, exits. It mirrors the structure of dreams or nightmares where action is abstract and uninterrupted, where rules bend to mood, and where symbols carry more weight than logic. Some viewers saw it as a continuity error, others as an oversight. But those who felt the discomfort without knowing why, they were the target. Because Walker isn't a man who reloads, he's a force that doesn't stop. Fact 18. A moment of physical violence became real, and the camera never looked away. There's a scene in Point Blank where Lynn lashes out, slapping Walker over and over in a surge of panic and sorrow. It's raw, too raw. You sense it the moment it begins. This isn't choreography, because it wasn't. Borman told Sharon Acker to let go, to keep striking until something shifted. Marvin, known for his stoicism, didn't react. He stood still, absorbed it, said nothing. What followed wasn't staged rage, it was emotional freefall. Each slap escalated, the tension cracked. At a certain point, it stopped being performance and became something else. Not violence, not catharsis, just pure, exposed unraveling. The take wasn't rehearsed, it wasn't repeated. What's in the film is what happened. When it ended, no one spoke. Marvin walked off set. Acker was shaking. Borman never cut the scene, because some moments on screen aren't constructed, they're captured. Fact 19. The film's colors weren't faded by time, they were drained on purpose. Because some moments on screen aren't constructed, they're captured. Borman and cinematographer Philip Lathrop intentionally flattened the color spectrum. They pushed blues and grays to the foreground. Skin tones were desaturated. Shadows weren't used for mystery, they were used to remove depth. Rooms were lit like hospital corridors. Offices looked like morgues. Every space Walker enters feels drained of warmth because that's exactly what Borman wanted. A visual world that reflects emotional death. To achieve it, they manipulated film stock with custom filters, used flat lighting, avoided soft lenses. Some shots were processed twice to reduce contrast. The result is visual entropy, not decay but stillness. Borman and cinematographer Philip Lathrop intentionally flattened the color spectrum. They pushed blues and grays to the foreground. Skin tones were desaturated. Shadows weren't used for mystery, they were used to remove depth. Rooms were lit like hospital corridors. Offices looked like morgues. Every space Walker enters feels drained of warmth because that's exactly what Borman wanted. A visual world that reflects emotional death. It's to show you what's missing. Fact 20. The final shot wasn't scripted, and its meaning still splits critics. The film ends not with bloodshed or triumph, but with Walker walking into fog. No payoff, no revenge, just distance, evaporation. And that wasn't the original plan. The script called for a final confrontation, guns drawn, lines spoken, closure delivered. But on set, Marvin pushed back. He wouldn't show up for this, he told Borman. So Borman made a different choice. He let Marvin walk away. No direction, no choreography, just motion. The fog rolled in naturally. The crew watched in silence. What they captured became the final image. No one speaks, no music swells. There's no catharsis, just vanishing. Borman never explained the choice directly. He only said, sometimes a story ends not with answers, but with the absence of them. Since then, critics have debated its meaning. Was it Walker's death? His freedom? His erasure? Or was it the film itself quietly disappearing before anyone could make sense of it? Bonus fact: some believe Walker was never alive to begin with, and the film is just the aftermath of what he left behind. It's a reading that's never been confirmed, but it doesn't need to be. In this interpretation, Walker isn't the protagonist, he's the consequence, a projection, a disturbance in the lives of those who betrayed him. He's not seeking retribution, he is retribution, not a man returned, but guilt personified. This theory reframes the entire film. Walker's detachment isn't trauma, it's absence. His silence isn't discipline, it's void. He doesn't behave like someone regaining control. He behaves like a phantom caught in the middle of someone else's reckoning. Every character he encounters breaks under the weight of his presence. They confess, collapse, vanish. He doesn't have to push. They unravel themselves. That's why no one ever uses his name, why his goals remain vague, why he seems unaffected by time or distance or injury. He's not remembering what happened. They are. Borman was once asked whether Point Blank is told from Walker's perspective. He answered with a smile, "Perhaps it's being remembered by the people who wronged him. That's why no one ever uses his name, why his goals remain vague, why he seems unaffected by time or distance or injury." This theory reframes the entire film. Walker's detachment isn't trauma, it's absence. His silence isn't discipline, it's void. He doesn't behave like someone regaining control. He behaves like a phantom caught in the middle of someone else's reckoning. Not resolved, just no longer needed. He never blinked, never reloaded, never looked back. But what if he was never really there? Tell us in the comment. Was Walker a man chasing revenge or the punishment itself taking shape? And if you've seen another film like Point Blank, a story where silence carries more weight than words, where memory warps into something more dangerous, we want to know. Because some characters don't return for justice. They return because someone still remembers them.